you.
That's so funny because I think I have its name.
Okay. And
oh shoot. Okay, so
yeah,
I'm just
let me
talking to this person who's trying to get.
Okay, and we'll start recording now.
Sounds good.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Carla Alegria, Project Manager with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Today's webinar, Change Leadership and Supervision, Using Reflective Practice to Support Staff and Sustainable Change, will be presented by Kathy Cave and Rachel Cox. Before we get started, I would like to go over some technical details of the WebEx software that we'll be using for today's webinar. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a Mac or PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. Second from the bottom is the chat feature. You may have to click on the chat cloud icon at the bottom right of your screen to open your chat box. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the presenter if you have questions regarding the training content. You may contact me if you have questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click on the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You'll see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select everyone. If you would like to respond to a question from the presenter or contact the center staff anytime during the session. You should click on me, Carla, to privately contact us if you are in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on everyone, type in where you're calling from, and then press enter. And we'll take a little moment to allow people to do that. I see that people are still logging on. Okay. Okay. Be moving forward then. While you can get a lot out of the chat feature, there are times when it moves quickly and it may be distracting. So if this is true for you, feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking on the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. Time permitting, we will moderate the Q&A towards the end via the chat box. And at the very end of the webinar, we'll post a brief survey in the chat. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connections, so please feel free to call back if that is a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact me, you may call WebEx Tech Support and resolve any issues. That phone number, which I will post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you for joining us today. I'll now turn it over to Kathy Cave.
Thank you so much, Carla. Welcome, everyone. Excuse me. Our conversation today is about change leadership, using reflective practice to support staff and sustainable change. I am the Senior Training Consultant excuse me, for the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. And Rachel and I have been working together for a number of years and really looking forward to having this conversation with you. Rachel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today. My name is Rachel Cox. I'm currently the Chief Program Officer at the New Mexico Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I've been doing domestic violence and rape crisis work for about the past 20 years, where I worked at a program as both a service provider and in a supervisory capacity. And I'm excited to share some of that, some of our own change leadership experience there today, and then also from the perspective of our coalition work. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, Kathy, and it's great to be with you after all these years together.
Yeah, thank you so much. Go ahead to the next slide. So the National Center is funded by the Administration of Children, Youth, and Families, Family, Youth, and Services Bureau of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The points of view in this document are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the official positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. A little bit about our National Center. The National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health really focuses on the intersection of domestic violence, trauma, substance use, and mental health. We provide a comprehensive array of training and technical assistance services and resources. We focus on research and evaluation, policy development and analysis, and increasing public awareness. As we were thinking about our conversation today, this quote just really, stays with me, and the picture stays with me even more. So much of the work that we do, and Rachel and I in our time together over these past few years, has been really great to have a partner in the work and have someone who can see what you're seeing and see where you want to go and be with you in it. And that has been such a great connection for us. Rachel, did you want to add anything?
I think the piece of really being together in this work, I think it's all hard work, but it's much harder when we're alone and isolated. And so taking that approach of maintaining these relationships together and from a growth-oriented perspective, because Kathy was there when our organization was starting our own change process. And it's a real testament to that relationship of trust and connection. So thanks, Kathy.
Thank you. It was a great ride. Next slide, please. I apologize, everyone. My voice is coming in and out. Allergies. So as we talk about leading a change process, at the National Center, we've been working for a number of years on really trying to articulate for ourselves and for programs for people who are involved in the work of domestic and sexual violence to really think about, if we're going to end those conditions, then what do we have to do? What kind of a stance do we take internally and then in our work with survivors? And where we came to, where we came to was really thinking about, so much of the world is using the language of being trauma-informed. And where we want to be is being more inclusive, being more open, being more present, I think. And thinking about, for us, being trauma-informed really does mean understanding the dynamics of domestic violence and of sexual violence, what happens in those interactions, and what does it mean to pay attention to folks who have had those experiences of being powerless, and that what we need to do in our work is always carry what we know and what we've learned about domestic and sexual violence. Also to know that being trauma-informed adds a layer to that, over our time doing this work, that may be a new lens for us. And then always thinking about human rights and social justice, because that's core to healing, it's core to naming what's happening in the world, it's core to thinking about not only what has happened, but what are the things we can do to change the conditions. And then always having a cultural, historical, and community context, because as survivors, we show up with all of that. You know, there's our history, there's our experience with domestic and sexual violence, but there's also generations and legacies of conditions that we've navigated and that our, you know, parents have navigated and that our grandparents have navigated that have left us in these places of experiencing cascading harms, as another friend of mine likes to say. And so as we think about those perspectives, we also have to look at our principles around nothing happens with survivors that survivors are not saying, yes, I want that. So having a survivor-defined approach is the core to everything that we do, that we center physical and emotional safety because we understand the impact of trauma, that without hope and resilience, where do we go, what do we see, and you know, how do we even, you know, attend to the journey that's in front of us? So really thinking about in our interactions with survivors, we may sometimes be holding that hope when people are not feeling it. And so we have to always recognize that hope is possible, hope is there, that resilience is there. Folks are with us, they're resilient. So no one has to do anything extra special to be resilient. They just have to be and be engaged and be connected for us to see their own resilience, their own resources, and then to work from those strengths to where we want to go, you know, and with them in partnership. And then we know that relationship and connection mean everything, that without relationship, without connection, we don't have an opportunity to use all of our best advocacy skills and make those kinds of connections. So wanting to say how important that is. Next slide, please.
Thank you for that, Kathy. You know, I think the piece that comes to mind for me as we're getting going in this conversation and maybe doing some of the setting of the stage for really what leadership at our organizations might look like if we're going to be doing it in these trauma-informed or transformative ways even, is really to honor the complexity of our position when we are in a supervisory and leadership role. You know, in terms of the everything that you just talked about, Kathy, that's present in these moments that we're working with survivors and working with our staff. I think it can be easy to take the shortcut when we're busy and overwhelmed to rely on our position or to rely on a personality as a leadership quality. But when we do that, it is a bit of a shortcut and it's not getting us where we're wanting to go in terms of really building up our organizational cultures, to be doing things from a survivor-driven framework, those kinds of things. And so as we get going on the conversation today, it can feel like, you know, we're going to be offering strategies and a bit of a roadmap and maybe some tools, but to never lose the idea that this is also not to oversimplify what people are engaging in when they're taking this on. So to just really honor how complex that can be when we're also asking very overwhelmed leaders to take on the idea of working in relationship, building trust, building shared vision, those kinds of things. So just wanted to take a moment as we're getting going here to really honor that complexity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I think that, you know, where that brings us is right to this idea around, you know, what does it mean to have a change leadership mindset? So much of what we do, we're doing it. You know, there's ways that for those of us who have worked in the field for a long time, that we operate, we go and we do, and because we're moving from crisis to crisis, or from issue to issue, or from concern to concern, or just from day to day, because, you know, there's joy in all of this as well, that because with the pace we move, it can be challenging to press pause and actually think about, if I want to change what's happening in my organization or change the way that we do it or change the way that staff have the resources and support that they need, all of that, that if any of those things are going to change, that as a leader, there's a way that we need to think about how that change happens. So for a change leadership mindset, so these are some of the pieces that we've been thinking about, really being able to first and foremost look in the mirror and say, this is where I am, that I am present or not, that I am clear or not, but to be able to reflect on how am I doing in this space related to implementing something different or enhancing something that we do. I also have to think about, as a leader, what's my personal feeling about being willing to lead. And so I might love my work and be committed to this work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I want to wake up every day and be the leader of everything that happens. And so some of us work really in collaborative ways and connect with staff easily and do things in a way that is collaborative and open and welcoming and sharing. And then others of us are more comfortable in, oh, wait, this is happening, let me handle it. And so I think in a leadership mindset, it's recognizing that all of those situations have a place and a time, and that in my role as a leader, what am I welcoming? And what is it that's not my favorite? And being able to be honest about that when we look. What are my own support needs as a leader? How do I know what resources are available, and how do I think about even the process of asking for help? And then what are not just my own attitudes around change, but what is happening for everyone else? How do we recognize that as a leader, am I aware of how people are feeling in my organization, in the day-to-day operations, but also as we try something new, try to expand something, try to enhance something. And so those challenges are real for us and for all of us in leadership roles. And in 30 years of working with organizations around leading change and leadership development, what I hear time and time again from folks in leadership positions is, I thought I was ready, but I'm not so sure. Or I thought I knew where we were going, but then these other changes popped up. And so we can have a mindset that's leadership ready, that is change ready, and then still feel like, not so much today, and that's normal, it's to be expected, and that we need to be able to tolerate that for ourselves. Next slide, please. Change brings shifts in an organization's culture and climate. So I wanted to spend a moment here just kind of thinking about that, right? That our organizational culture is the way we do things. This is how we do it. When we talk about opportunities for changing something, that change is going to cause a shift in the organizational culture. So what we do and how we do it is going to change. And so there may be some grief in that. There may be some loss in that. There may be a lot of excitement at the same time that there's grief and loss, because there's something familiar. And so even when that the signals for change are like screaming, like we have to do something different because this is so overwhelming or this doesn't work, then what we have to try to do is also recognize that I can be excited and struggle at the same time. And then the organizational climate is how it feels to work in a place. And in times of change, the thing to focus on is the organizational climate, because we can be in it together and deal with the changes in culture. If we don't feel like our climate is collective and that we're all hearing each other and seeing each other, recognizing each other and each other's needs, then we're really missing the opportunity. And it's harder to make change when the climate kind of is unchecked and people don't know and we're not talking about the challenges. So all of that is important in terms of how we operate in the world and how we operate as leaders and operate as people involved in the way our organizations change and the way change happens and the things that we need to do to stay connected in the process. Some of the things that we wanted to be sure to talk about are that while we're all experiencing, our thoughts and feelings related to change, there's also the stuff that impacts us every day in the work. And so life can be overwhelming, our work can be exciting, our work can be challenging, our work can be rewarding, and all of that is mixed in together. But as we talk about change and as leaders thinking about change, all of these other things are still in the mix. So people have their own personal experiences and responses to trauma and to being overwhelmed and to navigating all of the individual things that might happen to a person during their day, their regular day. Get up in the morning, head out, and there's things that are occurring in the world. And in our work, some of the things that are challenging come right to the surface because we're working with people who are maybe at the center of their own pain, and sometimes we're also in those places. And so my life doesn't stop being challenging because I go to work today. All of that is in the mix. And then whether our personal experiences and responses and how does that interact with what's coming up in the work. Many of us have experienced microaggressions related to identity, and that those kinds of experiences can create challenges, as do experiences with historical and collective trauma. So these things are connected in a way that the more trauma we experience, the more collectively that builds up. And so it's not just what happened to me today, but it's what happened in history to me and to mine and to my community, and what happens to folks who identify in the ways that I identify, and what does it mean then when those identities are devalued or made invisible or somehow even more marginalized. So all of that is in the mix before we ever get started with what I'm going to do in my workday. And then we have things that have to do with secondary trauma, which is the experience of having a trauma response, and the source of that experience isn't your own. And so that's, a natural part of what comes up in our work. And our organizations are struggling with capacity. So sometimes it feels like we have enough staff, we have enough resources, we have the knowledge to do what we need to do, that when survivors are struggling, we have what we need to be supportive to them in the way that we want to be and acting in line with our intentions. And then there are days when our organizations just don't have that. And so we have to recognize that that is a part of the regular impact that, of our work, not just on us, but on the folks we're trying to support, on survivors we intend to work with, on the children of survivors that are also struggling. So lots to kind of take in terms of what is impacting us. And so our role expectations are, sometimes I know exactly what I'm expected to do and I'm going to go do that. And other times expectations change. We work in a field where funding shifts a lot, and sometimes what someone is doing in their regular work may change because of, a grant ends or there's something new happening, and we kind of have to shift. What are we doing and how are we doing it? And so all of this stuff can contribute to stress and burnout. And I just want to name that burnout is when there's dissatisfaction with the structure of our organizations and the way our organizations run. So stress can be, motivating. It's like, oh, that didn't get done, it needs to get done, I'm going to go do that, I'll get it done. But when we're in a place where we're experiencing burnout, it's very difficult to rally those resources. And so all of these interactions and experiences are impacting staff, and how people respond to change can have a lot to do with what is in the mix that's playing out for them related to these other realities. Next slide, please. And, Rachel, I like to hear your thoughts about this too. And leading in advocacy organizations, I often will say, it's unique. There's stuff that we do in our work related to supporting survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and I've seen the same kind of experience in other advocacy organizations, like in peer support, for example, where the work we do and the people we hire are so energized around kind of naming the injustices and working to change those conditions, and doing that on a regular basis, and how hard it is then to experience, for example, power imbalances as staff when we're that attuned to those experiences, you know, in the world. And so it can make it really difficult for supporting survivors, supporting staff, you know, trying to have a cohesive organization where we're all kind of seen as equals and treated as equals, and that it feels that way. And so just to see,
What you're
Rachel, if
saying,
there was
Kathy,
anything you wanted to add. Yeah.
yeah, I think just briefly that, you know, I think sometimes, I mean, what you're saying is right. I mean, we're encouraging and supporting our staff to be working with folks to help them identify all the inequities, you know, in their lives and sort of to understand abuses of power. And so people that work at our agencies can have a really keen lens for this, right? And sometimes also see it where it's not. You know, sometimes, you know, an executive director might just need to make a decision, but when that is not collaborative or when we've not been treating staff with dignity and respect, it can be a real sort of a tense point, you know, at our agencies that are where we're these sort of epicenters in our society for power and control, you know. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think we want our staff to be clear about what the people they're working with are experiencing, and I think we can, as a field, avoid it when it comes to our own self-reflection as an organization. And I think, you know, we can be concerned that talking about it is going to amplify it or somehow make it worse. But I think what's true in my own experience is that it's playing out regardless, you know, whether or not we're addressing things directly or we're really exploring power with the people that are working at our agencies directly. And so it's there whether or not we want to look at it. And it is real, you know, either way. And so I think we're either playing catch up, you know, as supervisors when we're not addressing it, or we're also having really courageous conversations by addressing it sort of more directly. And hopefully some of the more conversation we have throughout our time together today will highlight some of that importance.
Yeah, thank you so much. So as we talk about, you know, what does it mean then to lead given these conditions and given the acute awareness that those of us who are doing this work have around misuse of power, around not naming power. I mean, sometimes it isn't so much that someone's deliberately trying to use power over, it's just that it happens because we're human, and we don't acknowledge it after it happens. So even if we reflect and say, oh, notice, oh, yeah, that could have gone better, or I could have done that differently, or people could have been included and collaborated with in these different ways, we do that reflection, it's then important to come back and have that conversation and name those things. So part of that is that transparency around communication, like being consistent, being able to say, you know, I really want us to be in conversation. I really want us to be able to connect. I really want us to be able to talk about the things that went well and the things that didn't. And then be able to come back and have more conversation about it. I don't know that we would need to, you know, process absolutely every single thing that happens in every single day, because that's overwhelming. But I think when you get that spidey sense of, that didn't feel quite right, or that didn't land the way I intended, to come back and hold that conversation with the folks who were involved in it or impacted by it. And that in the same way we hold others accountable, we have to hold ourselves accountable. And I think as a leader that is incredibly challenging, because we all have blind spots, right? But we need to have folks around us who will also say, maybe this got by you, but this happened, and here's the impact to what happened. And so being able to talk about that, being able to name those things, and then stay open and present around not just giving other people feedback and supervising staff in a way that we give them feedback. We also need to be able to open up and take it in. And so when someone says to me, you know, Kathy, this happened and I felt this way about it, I need to be able to say, oh, okay, so that got by me. Somehow I missed that. I need to recognize and acknowledge that something that I intended to go in a particular way, just didn't. That just makes me human. But then I have to come back and say, thank you for letting me know because I wasn't aware. And then, once you see something, you can't unsee it, right? Once you're aware, you can't act as if you're not. And so when we kind of gloss over things that have been, hurtful, harmful, uncomfortable, disconnecting, disoriented, because it happens in leadership, right? Those kinds of things happen in our interactions because sometimes we're moving at a pace that's different from the people who are working around us, that we're working with. And so, yes, let's just name that disconnections happen. And then the commitment is to create a space where we can all learn and grow, which means that I, too, as a leader, have learning and growing to do, and I'm open to that. And so feedback from all of my colleagues, not just folks I view as peers, because, sometimes in leadership positions we can, our structures just often don't support the ways that we would prefer to work. So even if we want to work more collaboratively, it can be really challenging to do that in our hierarchical organizations. So it takes an extra step. It takes some extra energy. It takes extra commitment. But if we are in that space of committing to that, then learning and growing together is the priority. So it isn't so much what can I do, to educate everyone. It's how do I support us all learning, including me. And then to embrace that that's my job and that's my role. And in leadership, that can be really challenging. So it's another place of finding peers who can be with us in the work, that can understand, that understand the shortcuts we have. Someone you can pick up the phone and call and say, this happened today, and that you don't have to explain all the things about how this happened and why this happened, that we can just be there with that person and in that conversation, and we understand each other. We understand the things that occur in leadership that are disconnecting. We understand the times where we have self-doubt. I was talking with a group of folks a couple of days ago, and so many folks use the word, what if everybody, doesn't know I'm not as smart or not as capable or not as prepared or not as, so that whole piece of, what if somebody finds out that I don't really know everything? And it's like, well, guess what? None of us knows everything. And so we need places where we can be brutally honest about our capabilities, our vulnerabilities, and our fears, so that we can, too, continue to grow. And if we're doing that for ourselves, we're more likely to offer that to staff.
I think just to piggyback, Kathy, on that, what you were just saying in terms of finding those places and those people, when we're engaging any kind of change process, if typically at domestic violence agencies across the country right now, that might be, around trauma-informed services. It could be around rules reduction work, or taking on something like reflective practice in your supervisory approaches. Finding other people who have been through it, or who are going through it. These spaces where we can be vulnerable, where we can learn, where we can struggle in all the ways that you were just naming, is so key. And I think it really embraces that principle of, if we are expected to be giving it, we also need to be able to receive it. So if we're expecting, our staff to be able to hold survivors and all of their needs and complexities, and then we as supervisors need to be able to hold staff, and then we need our own environment where we can be able to have that own experience of trust and vulnerability for ourselves. I in one of a change process that I connected with another organization in California, the other piece that really was helpful around this is, as soon as we started talking to each other, and I think, Kathy, this goes to some of the change dynamics that you were talking about in previous slides, and naming the dynamics that come up for all of us and what impacts us in that experience. Change processes at domestic violence agencies can bring out some very similar dynamics. And so pretty quickly, when we're talking to other leaders at other organizations or even in other states, it's like you could swap out the names, or swap out the problem, and it's almost the same exact dynamics. And so instead then of me being the problem or my staff being the problem, I was able to really depersonalize that and understand that we were in the context of change. And I wasn't able to see that as clearly until I was talking to somebody else who was going through that as well. And so being able to hold that you're in the context of change, or you're in the context of our unique agencies that are working with trauma and everything that goes with that, really helps us eliminate those pieces of blame, of our own shame, whatever it might be. And so finding folks, we just want to really underscore that today while we're talking about these processes.
So the information that we're sharing today is contained in two resources that we'll make available to folks. One is the Guide to Support Change Leadership, which is something that we created at the center to support implementation of organizations and practices and services that are accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed. And in the process of creating that resource, and then the second is a tip sheet on incorporating reflection. And we're going to talk about some of those concepts in a little bit, that what we kept coming back to in our conversations and in our thinking is that change leadership looks like something. And so what might that be? And so these critical attributes of effective change leadership are what it looks like. And so being able to prepare ourselves and be mindful about the time that it takes and what we need to navigate the day when you're in change processes, to prepare and to plan. And as a leader, it's not just me that needs to prepare and to plan, but I need to do that with everyone in my organization. And how important that is to collaborate in these ways where we're all saying, yes, this is where we want to go, this is what we want to do, this is how we want to do it. Let's prepare for that. To be really transparent and inclusive in all communication. And I think that can be challenging, especially when you work in organizations where people work remotely or people have different shifts. But finding ways to be absolutely sure that if we have plans for something that we're changing, that everyone needs to know and will know. And I think that takes commitment, and it takes looking at things maybe in a new way. And I think our response to this pandemic has really shown us that we can do things differently, we can support people, we can hang in there together. The shift was challenging, but we were able to do it. And even as some things started to open back up in some places, some of those strategies that we learned during COVID actually are things that were innovations, and we're going to continue to hold on to those. So while not everything is easy and solid, like we get that, right? It's like change is a little bit like being on a boat. There's a lot of movement. And so being able to have everybody, hearing what they need to hear, part of the planning, party to the all the things we're thinking, that we're sharing ideas, that people get to contribute their ideas, not just kind of hear about it, oh, this is what happened at the meeting today, but there's an active way that folks can participate. We can create that. We can create those opportunities and make that happen. I think, earlier we were talking about accountability, and just to name that again here, it's accountability for others, but it's also really accountability for ourselves, that we need to be able to be in spaces where we can hear from staff that our communication wasn't what it needed to be, or we can hear from our colleagues that someone was left out of something, and to be able to hear that in a way that says, oh, I can change that, or I'm open to that. Let me figure that out. Let me talk to folks, and we can figure it out. And so it's important to kind of hold that space for that. And then as we think about organizational well-being, that's not just for times of change. It's all the time. And I think that in our field, it's still something that we struggle with a lot, to really think about what does it mean to think about how we cultivate self-awareness. What does it mean to think about we have active conversations about well-being and self-care, and we look at that as an opportunity to create new policy and practice. It's not just saying, staff, yes, go take care of yourselves, you all do that. What we're saying in a change leadership space is that we need to look at how do we support well-being, and then how does that translate into the ways that we relook at our policies, relook at, for example, even how we do time off. How do we spend our energy when we're navigating so much with, being short-staffed or being, we still have people working remotely. Like there's so much confusion, in our day-to-day sometimes because we're constantly moving and our field is constantly evolving. So most important, I guess if I were to relook at this list, it might be to put organizational well-being at the top of it, because that is the piece that will hold us together while we're doing all these other things. And then as we've named already, creating space for ongoing growth and learning. And so I wonder if folks who are listening have any ideas to add, and if there's anything you'd like to put in the chat or to add for Q&A for us to be thinking about related to the things that we're talking about so far. And especially around challenges. I mean, I think that we can name some of the challenges that we're going to do, talk about in just a moment, but also there may be things that we've not thought about or things that have come up for you that aren't represented here, and it would be really amazing to be able to hear from some of you all about your experiences. So I think for leaders in times of change, one of the things that we're called on to do is to model any new skills that we're implementing or new ways of being, new ways of doing things, while we're still learning that and while we're still trying to figure out, what's our own comfort level. And so that's important for us to know and pay attention to, and to consider that, oh, wait, I am doing something I don't feel confident about. I am doing something I'm not quite sure of. I'm doing something that I believe will be better, but we're still in the process of getting there, right? And so that's something for us to hold on to and think about. How we balance power, we've talked about a little bit already. Again, just making sure that we're creating space where we can take it in when someone is saying to us, that was uncomfortable because it was a blatant misuse of power, or it was so subtle we didn't notice it, but guess what happened? There was this moment of because I said so, right? And so while there, again, as Rachel was saying earlier, there's times when, as leaders, we have to make decisions. We have to be able to move forward, and we have to be able to do that in a way that keeps our organizations afloat, but at the same time be open to what can I share, how am I sharing, can I take feedback about what I need to share and share differently. And so that's, it's on us to do so. I think the piece around staff participation and role conflict is that sometimes what happens in an organization, you'll have a small group of folks who get together, or a couple of folks, or there's one staff person who says, what, this could be different, I'm going to change it. And then they go ahead and they do that. And then when it comes to the attention of leaders, sometimes folks have to backtrack because there were either things they didn't know about that were in the mix, or there's unforeseen consequences of making that change, or that staff have been independent in making this change, and then when we have to backtrack, there's conflict. And, I'm the supervisor, what's my role? I'm, the person who had, tried to really make something different happen, and I thought it would work really well, but now I'm getting this feedback that, I was too much, or I stepped too forward, or usually it comes down to feeling as if you know, I've done something wrong or I've done something bad, and there's all this shame that gets attached to it. So if we can start from a more proactive place about naming the things that we want to change, talking about them before change happens. Let's just talk about it. I've had an idea to change this, to do something different. How can we do that? And who needs to be involved in that change? And how do we work together in that change? And so right from the beginning, we're in a space to talk about whether or not it's a good idea, and, you know, making a time plan that involves, making a plan that involves time of, let's check it out. Like, go ahead and try it. Let's see how it works. And let's come back together in a week or in a day or 2 weeks or a month, whatever it needs to be, so that we can then together reflect on it and talk about it. How did that go? Did it go well? Do we need to do something different? And I think the other thing that happens a lot is that there are all kinds of ideas for change. People will start something, yes, we're going to do this, and we're going to focus on this, and we're going to do this work. And then that idea and that beginning work, that early work, stalls out, gets lost, isn't sustaining, and isn't sustainable sometimes because we didn't do the planning on the front end. And so just to be thinking about that, because it's when there's a start of a process and a lot of energy is put in the beginning, and then it kind of fades out and doesn't go anywhere, it can really impact the way it feels to work in your organization. So it comes back to that organizational climate check around how are folks doing, how are folks feeling, what are folks thinking, and that all, again, is in the mix.
I think piggybacking again, Kathy, a little bit on the idea of challenges that we might be running into during a change process, and also remembering the context of our organizations. The people working at our agencies, I think frequently and understandably feel like, you know, that they're involved in what might be like life-saving work, right? Or essential, critical services, these words that we hear in our work. And so they've been doing it a certain way. Let's say people have worked at our agencies 3 to 5 years, some of them 15 to 20 or more. And they were doing it the way that they had been taught. And so when we introduce these change processes, let's take like a rules reduction piece around working with somebody with substance use or something like that. When we introduce a new way of how our agency is going to do that, people who had been doing it the way we had done it previously can really all of a sudden be hit with a feeling of like, have I caused harm? What have I done wrong? And so how to really, you know, engage people in why we're, you know, engaging in this change process, because people can really, you know, get resistant in that reaction. That our impulse for change can be very exciting, and we're growth oriented, and for others it just lands that it's, and it can feel insulting, I think, to some staff, and when they're not really clear or understanding why we're changing at this point. And so we want to take the time, and we want to be committed to that process so that we can bring along staff who have been with us and that they feel valued in that work. And people will still have those feelings about navigating change, but how can we be sort of carrying them with us as we're going through it? And really, I think what that is anticipating that this is going to be a reaction to change, anticipating, going back to that visual graphic that Kathy had with all the different arrows of what people are bringing to this process. Once we know some of that, it can be our role as supervisors and leaders to anticipate that that's in the mix, and to help maybe even reflect that for our staff. And so I think what can be challenging also is that we're going through our own change process as leaders, and when we're guiding through that, we're always on, you know, a little bit of uncertain ground ourselves. And so I think patience, compassion, and understanding that all of these things will be there for us is at least where we can start. And we need strategies, Kathy. You can tell us a little bit about that. We need some strategies for all that overwhelm and all those challenges.
Uh-huh.
Give us the strategies.
Yeah, so much of what we do is, in the moment, and, especially in this work. And, I loved what you were saying around just like acknowledging that that's just part of how it is,
Yeah.
right? And so being able to anticipate that. And so, again, really focusing on, I think the most important thing is always on organizational climate. What does it feel like? Do we have connection? Are we engaged? Is our communication where it needs to be? Because that one thing can influence not whether or not people have doubt, but whether or not they can acknowledge, yeah, I felt doubt then, but I'm okay with this now, or I'm moving over in this direction. And so if we're not paying attention, if we're not noticing, then there's an opportunity that we miss for people to have their growth and their individual change acknowledged by supervisors and leaders. I think having realistic and functional timelines also super critical, that when we're thinking about planning, that we actually do things in a way that supports not only individual well-being, but the organization's well-being. So can we do things in a way that says, you know what, I know that, especially I'm thinking right now about a lot of the conversations that are happening in programs across the country around racial equity and inclusion work, and really thinking about those dynamics. And so some of us are really impatient about it and want it all to change yesterday. And some of us are a little more okay, I won't say comfortable, but a little more okay with the time that kind of a process takes, and that those processes can be uncomfortable, and there can be a lot of, sweat and tears involved in those conversations. And so how do we make sure we stay in those conversations for the long haul? And part of it is by setting realistic timelines from the beginning. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. This is not going to change overnight, and we are committed to continuing to work. Because when we can't do that up front, often what happens is there's a sense of, oh, we didn't really mean it when we said that, when we made that commitment. So making sure that people know that our organization is a work in progress, and that what we're trying to do with whatever change we're involved in does connect to our values. It connects to why we do the work. It connects to what brings us to the work. And it really supports us to maintain a sense of we're not there yet, but we're still moving forward. It's when people lose that sense of forward movement that, our hearts get really heavy, and it's really hard to believe that, are we in this together? And we start to question and doubt those things, right? And so when there are disconnections that occur, to deal with them right away. Don't let things fester. Don't let things go. When you notice when something is named, navigate it together. Talk about, even if we can't do it in this moment because, this happened 5 minutes ago, to name that this thing did happen, whatever that disconnection might be, and commit to making change. Because doing nothing can feel on the surface that it gets easier over time, but with that time is also coming a sense of doubt, a sense of mistrust, a sense of, I'm really in this by myself. And so as we continue to move forward, really thinking about those kinds of things, and again, the importance of feedback. So next slide, please. So can we really take that feedback in and not see it as a threat, but see it as a spark for curiosity, growth, and change? And that's what's key in this, I think. Next slide. So as we think together and move together and grow together, we really have to then, just pause and say, we're here, we're in this, and it's not connected to whether or not this one person stays in the mix. When we are truly engaged in change, what we notice is that it's not whether or not I show up or one other person does or doesn't show up. It's that when we're committed in this way, the change process moves forward, whether we're at the table or not. And so how do we put that in? So one of the program directors we've worked with, said any ground game would disappear when the person who was most interested left, or when staff's fears and resistance were more powerful than leadership's commitment to the change process. So part of how we think about this, if we're going to implement change, if we're really thinking about how do we make our services more accessible, more culturally responsive, more trauma-informed, that we have to look at growing the capacity so that all of our staff can lead. A friend of mine calls it lead from any seat, and I like to think about it is that we need to be able to lead from every single seat. And so as we start to shift our conversation to thinking about the use of reflection as part of what is a skill that can support a change process, that I just want to say from the beginning that reflection is a process that any of us can use. And so when we know what it is, when we know how to use it, we can support each other as peers through using a reflective conversation. We can use it as a tool to really support and sustain us all throughout a change process, and think about ways of connecting to how are we doing as we're doing the work. And there's all kinds of opportunity to use the skill and to practice the skill. And for me, it primarily comes up because it's a resource for sustaining a change process, and we can really engage each other in ways of naming what is and isn't going well, really thinking about how we can make a shift, and then having some strategies to do that.
I think when we're really thinking about all the different roles a supervisor can play, there's going to be those administrative pieces, there's going to be the policy rewrites, all of those different parts. But considering reflective practice as a tool in your toolbox, right? As an essential tool in the toolbox to your leadership role. I think in agencies that have been able to implement that, it goes hand in hand in a sustainable change process. And in part, it's because in taking that time to reflect in supervisory sessions, we're really building that sense of trust. If there's a rupture, it's an opportunity for a repair. It slows the work down with our supervisees. And we're really building, again, that leadership model that goes beyond just, I am the shelter manager or I am the clinical director. And it actually transitions it into that leadership relationship that we have. And when we can take the time to do this, even though it can feel and sound very time consuming at the get-go, long term, then we have an agency where staff are on board with the values, understand their role, and are able to act autonomously and in trustworthy ways, as are we as their supervisors, and everything can become a much more interconnected, dynamic organization. And instead of spending time maybe sometimes putting out fires, figurative fires, hopefully, at our agencies, then we're actually just sort of getting to the business of the work through this process. So it's really that trust building and relational, it can add that real trust building and relational component to our work. And as far as the reflective practice piece goes today, one of the pitches that Kathy and I are really making is a little bit of sort of why to consider this in your supervisory practice. There's going to be some how, but it's really today the why, because, I think for our agencies, really understanding the trauma that is there in the air that we're breathing and on the day-to-day that staff are experiencing, and the dysregulation that it can have at our agencies. So the piece of why we really want to be considering reflective practice is to get at the impact of the trauma at our organizations. The impact of our trauma can mean that staff can be avoidant in their work. It can mean that staff are sometimes overwhelmed by that. And what we want to be able to do in this reflective process is really slow the work down. We can be, because of the impact of that trauma, sometimes it can be hard for staff to differentiate between what is a real crisis and what just becomes, I'm operating at crisis level all the time. I can remember down the hallway from my office, I could kind of always tell how things were going at the agency. You know, someone that worked there would wear high heels, and you could hear sort of like click, 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 and then you might hear click, 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 and then you'd hear other feet kind of joining the chorus, and everyone was click, 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 and I go out and it's like, what's going on? And they're like, there's no paper for the copier. And so just like that piece of like the pace that our organizations can get running at when everything can feel sort of almost survival based. And then that role that we're taking on when we're engaging in a reflective practice as supervisors is we're committing to slowing that down for our agency. I think, and really getting at that impact of the trauma, impact of the crisis work as much as we can. Another piece I think that can be really important, and I think this relates to slowing things down, staff, you know, might not even be aware of their own lived experience and its impact on what on their work, and so they might additionally be unaware of other cultural disconnections or their own implicit biases when they're interacting with staff, with survivors with other lived experience. And so being able to get curious about this, get curious about how their own history and life story impacts their work, encourages them to be open and curious to the person that they're working with, and be aware that there might be something there, you know, that place of maybe being understanding of knowing what we don't know or not knowing what we don't know, thinking about these possibilities that are in the interactions. And staff benefit from support to strengthen their relationships with survivors, to identify strategies that can really help them individualize the service, being able to think about the unique needs of that survivor. We're not wanting a one size fits all for any service, including our supervisory practice. I think when we're coming to this and we've sort of been like, okay, this sounds good. I want my organization, you know, to slow down the clicks of the heels, and I want to buy into this. I think one of the steps, you know, as we're beginning is to be thinking about what are really our intentions, or what can we commit to as in our supervisory role. And again, we're thinking about introducing this as part of our practice. We want to be able to think about staff's unique needs, maybe their own learning style. We want to be able to really help them be truly most helpful to survivors in their work. Again, this is something that we're offering that can sound like it takes time, but if we can front load this work, then that staff has been given their own preparatory work to be able to really be responsive to the people that are coming into our agencies. We want to expand our perspectives, be open to that. You know, I think when we're looking at all of these, it's also helpful to think about, even like, you know, as our own inventory, looking at this. Sometimes we can go like, okay, yeah, I got that. I'm definitely committed. I'm open to prioritizing staff development. I'm going to put money in my budget for this. But to also think about where we might struggle. For myself, stepping into supervision, stepping into leadership, that piece of cultivating my own self-awareness, being able to recognize when I was doing well, when I was not doing well, to be able to step back and look at that. When my vulnerability was maybe a strength in the supervisory interaction, or when, if I was not doing well about something, how I needed to step back and get support maybe from that peer group that we were talking about earlier. So we want to be able to be really clear with what are we able to bring to the table on this. And if we find ourselves, you know, so let's take this last one, for example, being able to really notice strengths and resiliencies, share positive feedback. It's important that we can do this authentically. And if we're having a day where that's not possible, then we need to step back and think about this. But we want to be able to again, be cultivating this from the beginning, to take the time to consider it as we're getting going, as we're getting started.
Yeah, it makes me think too about that as leaders, there's a range of responses around this idea of, the work in our organization takes all of us, and it takes collaboration. Well, some days we can feel very collaborative, and some leaders feel very collaborative, and others that's just not how we came into this work. So it doesn't feel that it's comfortable. I think about it as sometimes it feels like an itchy shirt. It's like I'm doing it, but I don't know that I like it, right? Or that it feels uncomfortable, or that there's something here that, I can see where there's benefits, but I can also feel that this is a shift for me. And as leaders, I think that there's lots of this work where that's just truly the case. And so there's a range of how prepared am I, how willing am I, and maybe I'm not. And so to be honest and authentic in that process of even reflecting about that and making decisions is really helpful.
This piece of being able to hold the strong feelings, complexities, and not knowing. Kathy, I think you've spoken some about that so far, but I think especially also when we're in the context of a change process. 10 years down the road, we've really sort of solidified the idea of knowing that our not knowing is part of what we role model, all those pieces. But when we're in a change process and people are having big feelings and reactions to it, our ability to really hold that, I think is on that list of challenges. I'm not sure if you want to say anything more about that, Kathy.
I mean, just that it's right, that it's a normal process. And I think there's staff are looking to us, survivors often looking to us as leaders to make decisions, to know the answers and to have them. And for us, we often have that expectation of ourselves. So to be truly okay with, what, I don't know, but let's see if we can figure it out. Or let's see what we can do. Let's see what else we can learn. So to make that, even in that moment, to make it more of a we thing rather than a I need to fix this or I need to know thing. And I think for staff, our advocates get in that same kind of place with survivors of, oh, there's a need, let me find an answer. Or there's a question, let me fix it. Like whatever that might be, whatever that challenge is and what it looks like, the more leaders can model, let's figure it out together. The more advocates can model, let's figure it out together. And the more survivors can model, let's figure it out together. And so it just does have that rippling effect where it doesn't all need to be just me by myself. I need to do this and I need to make this decision, or I need to know. So as we're thinking about kind of the qualities of reflection, I just wanted to, name a few of these things to really kind of highlight that the most important thing that we can do is to provide a consistent, predictable time. So in times of change, when things are uncertain, it really is urgent to have that predictability, to have that consistency, so people can trust the conversation, trust the situation, and even when they're experiencing doubt, or there's distance, or there's time that is kind of spreading things out, that we can come back to this place and really think about, in our supervisory relationship, what are we offering to people? What is it that people can experience in terms of trust, that they experience being supported and they experience being respected? And so as a supervisor, it's not just what do I intend, but staff really need to experience the exact things that we're saying we want them to do with survivors in terms of feeling deep dignity, feeling deep respect, feeling deeply trusted. And so that has to grow. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen by accident. It's intentional, and when we have to live up to that. And so again, it's how do we have these spaces, and what's our intention to create spaces where people can continue to grow in the work and that we're building their skills. So it's not just feel better is here are some skills that will help you to do better, and that's in the messaging and that's important. And then for us to also think about that in our interactions with one another, that as an advocate, there's a unique strength that I have. There's also unique struggles that I have. There are things that I can do. I want my supervisor to really understand that. I want my supervisor to be able to help me identify those strengths. So as leaders, as we see a strength, we need to name it. And then when stuff comes up where people are really feeling strongly one way or another about something, that we have space for that. And one of the things that I do for myself is that if I'm having a hard conversation with someone and they get upset, the first thing I check in about is, this is not coming at me. This is being put in the room for us to sort out together. If someone is, directing some negativity at me, someone's calling me names, somebody is harming me in that way, I won't sit still for that. I won't participate in that. I'll name it and say, you know what, this is happening in a way that's not okay. So let's take a minute, collect ourselves, figure out what we need to do so that we can each come back and really talk about this. And so if someone is really, kind of feeling or, in the moment, they're in that, and maybe it's a trauma response, maybe it's anger, maybe they're furious. We need to create spaces in our supervisory relationships where people can express all of that and that we can hold it. We can take it in. We can create the container that says, you know what, let's take a minute. Let's take a minute. I'll be right here. And that offer has meaning and it's real. And so when we talk about people being vulnerable, one of the things that can get in the way of being able to navigate this is that if as a leader I'm uncomfortable or having my own responses to a raised voice. So if that's the case, I might try to arrange that no one talks to me in a loud voice, which is unrealistic and uncomfortable and, shuts down lots of conversation. So as long as someone is not being attacking of me with their words, I can hear a loud voice. I can take that in. I can know and I can navigate that. And I can stay in it with the person until we're ready to have a conversation. And so it's helping folks and supporting folks to get through that actually cements and strengthens the relationship.
I think along the lines of sort of why this can be such a good fit for our agencies in addressing the trauma, in addressing the power dynamics that can be present, the strategies and the qualities of reflective supervision, fundamentally, there is a belief that the answer is going to come either from the relationship or is already there in the staff, right? But that due to the overwhelm or whatever else, that they don't have access to that in that moment. And so these strategies create self-empowered employees, I think. And so if we are struggling with power dynamics at our agency, sometimes we can inadvertently contribute to that when someone comes to us, they say, I don't know what to do about what's happening in the shelter. And our supervisory approach might be like, well, I'll just tell you what to do in the shelter, instead of being able to slow that down and let the answer emerge from the staff person, emerge from the trusting relationship. So part of what we're also really doing with this is getting at some of those dynamics that we can name that are present at trauma service organizations. It can be, I don't want to overpromise here, but it can be a real remedy in a lot of ways for some of our sort of tensions around power in our organizations. So when we're really engaging with that, when we're really using these strategies, instead of using maybe our own expertise, when someone comes to us to ask us the question about what's happening in the shelter, we're using attunement and our own mindfulness. We're slowing things down. If they're coming and it was a very upsetting thing that happened, we're not taking on the strong feelings. We're sitting with them. while they regulate their own. And we believe in these practices as a way to, again, let the answers emerge from the advocate themselves, from the relationship. And if we're not able to do these things, again, it's really important to be realistic with ourselves. If someone is a shelter manager or an executive director who just had to pull a shift and is now working on an OVW grant and getting ready for a board meeting that night, we need to be clear around, can we participate in gentle inquiry right now? You know, these things can be hard when we are not doing well. And I want to be, you know, realistic about the load that everyone's carrying. So then we want to think about, when do we use these strategies? That's when the mindfulness can really come into play. We might want to be clear that we're not able to engage in that way right now. And right now doesn't mean I never will, but we want to be able to maintain that self-awareness to know, is this a time for this practice with my supervisee? And I think the thing that can be helpful around attunement, for those of us with all kinds of lived experience, attunement I think about as a relational place where I'm not overwhelmed by my own needs and I'm not overwhelmed by the person that I'm interacting with. And physically, that should feel pretty regulated, pretty stress-free. So I think another part, a strategy that I would add to this, is just that own physical awareness of how we feel in terms of the relationship. Um, all of this is in the tip sheet that the center has produced that Kathy was referencing earlier. And so these skills and strategies are also listed there. I want to just give a brief example in terms of a supervisory opportunity, right? So like, I can remember this would be a common, not an uncommon experience. Somebody might come down from the shelter and be like, you know, so-and-so was giving me attitude, and they're all riled up about an interaction that they might have had with somebody that was living in the shelter. And again, if we are not engaging in some of those reflective strategies, the absence of that might sound like, well, maybe we need to talk with her about whether or not she should continue, you know, like how long she has here, right? When the problem is presented and then we as the supervisee engage in problem solving, then frequently the people we're serving can, you know, they kind of become identified as the problem. Instead, if we've been able to create clear expectations with the people that we're working with, that when they bring us those interactions, so-and-so's giving me attitude, blah, 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 right? That we come from them with these key pieces, that we're also going to be talking about their effectiveness in that setting, and we're going to be role modeling feedback, thinking about, how am I impacting the people I'm working with? How am I impacted by them? And quickly in an interaction like that, you might realize, oh, this advocate went back early in the morning to try to get a housing form filled out with a person who was trying to get their child ready for childcare, and it wasn't the right time. And so that's the other piece I think that can be really, really important, is that we're not just listening to problem solve, we're not just listening to commiserate with the staff member, we're actually trying to talk about them in a way that means the next time they have an interaction with that resident or that person in services, that we're moving forward in a new way. So slowing that down, increasing the staff member's awareness that this person was going in a different direction and I had that housing form and I maybe didn't approach them at the right time. Next time they interact with them, they're going to have an increased awareness about, how am I impacting this person? How can I be more effective? And we want to make sure that that's a clear framework for what the supervision can look and sound like. And that piece of considering it from a different perspective, I think is when that person brings the rage, the upset about what just happened, the slowing it down, what was going on for you, what was going on for them. Is there anybody that you've worked with before that's reminding you of this moment? You know, those kinds of things. That advocate then becomes able to rely on their own internal resources and their own perspective taking to be able to be more effective in the interaction with the staff. I mean, with the survivor, excuse me.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, you know, the highlight here in terms of, before you begin, the things to think about, again, how ready am I, but also to consider that, you know, folks can talk about their experiences as, these are things I think, or this is how I feel, and that it's up to staff and it's up to the advocate, it's up to the person to determine whether their level of comfort with thoughts or feelings. As supervisors, our role is to meet them where they're at. And so really be focused on creating that comfort, and that any one of us could be unsure or untrusting, that we might be incredibly uncomfortable and unsafe, and I do think there's a difference. But I also think that we need to have that trustworthy relationship to even be in a space to talk about and unpack, is this a lack of safety, or I'm just uncomfortable right now? And so those things that we've been talking about in terms of power and whether or not people can take in feedback, that those are key themes in all of this in terms of how we work together and what the process looks like for reflection and whether or not we're effective at it. So it isn't for everybody and it isn't for every situation, but can be incredibly helpful.
I think one of the biggest expectations I think can be clarified. I think frequently somehow reflective practice really has a reputation for being talking about feelings. That's what people think that they're doing when they're as a supervisor, and that maybe also as a staff, that's what you think that you get to do. And I think if we can provide a really clear orientation for both staff and for supervisees, it can become clear about what this is and what this isn't. So this is not necessarily just getting lost in the feelings of what happened. This does not become a therapy session. This is really about a growth-oriented approach where the thoughts and feelings might be a piece, but we're talking about what are they going to do differently next time. This becomes maybe professional development about different training that they might need access to, right? So this is not, I think it's really important to emphasize that this is not just sort of talking about feelings experience. And I think the more we can really double down on that in the beginning, it can increase supervisors' comfort level with it, because I think they can get worried that we'll get a little lost there, and that it's really growth oriented and accountability driven.
Yeah, thank you so much. It just makes me think about the times when, as supervisors, we may attempt to be in these conversations and have a reaction when staff won't participate. And I just try to encourage folks to think about it as, if people are not participating, it's either that the expectations are not clear or that they're not safe and comfortable to do this way. So I just wanted to come back and talk about that a minute. So thanks for this piece.
Yeah. I think, Kathy, that you also named a little bit of this earlier, or even just now, that piece of when we are not seeing people participate, what does that tell us, and how it can be an opportunity for us to really step back. We want to normalize, absolutely, that staff discomfort will be talked about, and that it can, and we want to also have the expectation that it's ours to work towards our own skills to be able to hold, but that if any of that has really been a rupture, how to step back, how to think about how do we, intentionally re-engage on this. But that does not mean our other supervisory practices stop, because we're incorporating reflective practice as a piece. And so if there's still a strength-based approach, if there's still administrative pieces, all of those parts, but that maybe the reflective component, we would stop for a moment while we're getting going on intentionally re-engaging the reflective practice component.
Yeah, thank you. And so just, in terms of a structure, what this might look like between two people, right? There's the person who's had an experience that they're going to talk about. And then there's the supervisor or other person who's providing some support and wants to look at how can we do this differently. So there's the event or experience. So it's tell me about what happened, what did happen, what did that look like. Then exploring the thoughts or feelings is really around, it's the tell me more about it, but also what was happening for you when this was happening. So first it's the what, and then it's the thoughts and feelings about it. This piece around checking perspectives is really the time where you as a supervisor are able to notice that oh, so I understand what happened. I understand the thoughts and feelings. Maybe there's some questions to clarify. Let me do that. I might have some more to ask about. But I'm also going to say what I think. And I'm going to draw from my experience as a supervisor or as an advocate, if I've had past experience with that, or from my conversations with other people who have had similar challenges. And I'm going to give that feedback, and I'm going to share those perspectives. And the hope for the end is that in this conversation that we'll move forward in a way that there's a new plan, or if this challenge comes up again, the staff is more equipped to handle it differently, or to ask for support, or to do whatever needs to happen in a different way so that we don't end up in the same space around a difficulty. And so what this does take is for, again, staff to feel that I can say I made a mistake. I can say that I need to do something different. I can say that there's got to be a better way to go about this, and feel supported in that, and not feel like, oh my goodness, I should have known better. And so if we get caught up in the, I didn't do it right, and then it's, from there, I'm not worthy, I'm not educated, I'm not this, I'm not that. All those messages that come from shame can also just derail us and derail what we're trying to do with survivors. So to be able to come back to those interactions with survivors, for example, or with colleagues that don't go well, and make space for, this is how we want to do it. Let's try it a different way. Let's see if it goes better. And then come back and talk about that in supervision with someone who understands. So these are the examples I was just giving about some conversations. On the tip sheet, we also offer some ways of checking in, some different conversations that folks can have.
Kathy, this is us. We're wrapping up here now for folks who are attending on the phone and maybe haven't been able to see the slides. Hopefully all of that will be sent out so folks can engage with some of the visuals that were here that Kathy was just describing. But part of what comes up for me as we're wrapping up is that piece of, this was said some earlier, but giving it to be able to receive it, and receiving it so that you can give it, I think is that piece of the environment that we're talking about creating. So we want fundamentally the people we're getting services from, giving services to, providing services for, to be able to have a very survivor-directed experience. We want that to be provided in a trustworthy and collaborative space. And so then we need to offer that to staff, and then we need to seek it as leaders. And so it's this piece of creating all of these different holding environments where the optimal relationships can emerge from. And so hopefully from today, that piece of introducing this reflective practice, the component of relationship building and trust building in a change process to create sustainable change has been communicated. We value and are so appreciative of all the work happening across countries, across the communities. We really value it, and thank you for your time with us here today.
Thanks. And if you go to the next slide, I can share the information about the resource. Yay. So the guide that we've been talking about, and this information is contained in, is it's supporting change leadership. And so this is the second in a series around how do we make change to be accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed organizations in a way that leaders who are in the midst of this process are also feeling supported. So thank you all for attending. There's also on the next slide a resource list and ways at the end for you to be able to get a hold of us and reach us for either to talk more about some of these pieces or additional information about these pieces. And we thank you both, thank all of you so much, excuse me.
Thank you, panelists, for today's webinar, and thank you to everyone who jumped on and everyone who stayed after all the back-end technical issues. Know that within the next week, we will send you the follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar, in addition to the slides and handouts referenced, all of which will be available on our website. You will also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today and an evaluation. Thank you so much again for staying on, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.